There's a quiet assumption in modern culture that if someone isn't visible, something must be wrong. If they're not posting their face, their lifestyle, their moments, then maybe they're insecure. Maybe they lack confidence. Maybe they have nothing worth showing. But that assumption says far more about the system people are living in than the individual being judged. Because for many empaths, the absence of self-display is not a sign of weakness. It's often the result of something far more difficult to develop. Not because they have less to show, but because they no longer feel the need to prove it. And that's where the psychology becomes interesting. Most people have been conditioned, quietly, repeatedly, to equate attention with value, to believe that visibility equals importance. The more you are seen, the more you matter. The more people react to you, the more real you feel. And over time, this becomes internalized so deeply that many people stop questioning it altogether. They begin to measure themselves, not by who they are, but by how they are perceived. And this is exactly where the distortion begins, because perception is unstable. It changes, it fluctuates. It depends on mood, context, audience, timing. But identity was never meant to be built on something that unstable. And yet, for many people, it is. Social media only accelerates this process. It turns validation into something visible, something countable, something addictive. Likes become signals of approval. Comments become emotional reinforcement. Views become a distorted form of status. And slowly, without realizing it, people begin to outsource their sense of worth, not consciously, but behaviorally. They start checking reactions. They start anticipating responses. They start adjusting themselves based on feedback. And over time, something subtle happens. Identity becomes performative, not fully fake, but no longer fully authentic either. It becomes shaped, edited, positioned, not just lived, but presented. And most people adapt to this without noticing. But empaths often don't. Because empaths tend to be unusually aware of emotional undercurrents. They don't just see what's happening. They feel what's driving it. They notice the tension behind expression, the need behind confidence, the performance hidden inside self-presentation. They see the layer beneath the layer. Not just someone posting a photo, but someone asking without saying it, "Do I matter?" And once you begin to see that pattern clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee because you realize something uncomfortable. A lot of what looks like confidence is actually negotiation. A negotiation for attention, a negotiation for validation, a negotiation for reassurance. And for someone who is highly perceptive, that dynamic can feel exhausting, not because expression is wrong, but because dependence feels fragile. There's a difference that most people never fully understand. Wanting to be seen is human, but needing to be validated is where instability begins. Because the moment your sense of self depends on response, you give that response power over you. Your mood shifts with reactions. Your confidence fluctuates with attention. Your peace becomes conditional. And many empaths begin to recognize this pattern early, or learn it through experience. So they begin to step back. Not completely, but consciously. They begin to question the system, not aggressively, but internally. And the question often sounds like this: if I already know who I am, why do I need to constantly show it? That question creates distance, distance from performance, distance from pressure, distance from unconscious participation. And from that distance, clarity begins to form, because they start to see something others often miss. The more identity becomes tied to public reaction, the easier it is to lose control of it. Because now your sense of self is no longer fully yours. It's partially shaped by how others interpret you. And interpretation is unpredictable. Some people will admire you. Some will misunderstand you. Some will project onto you. Some will judge you without context. And if your identity is exposed to all of that constantly, it becomes unstable by design. Empaths often sense this instability more intensely than others because they don't just notice reactions, they absorb them, they process them deeply, and that depth changes how exposure feels. What feels casual to one person can feel overwhelming to another. What feels like simple sharing can feel like unnecessary vulnerability. So instead of leaning further into visibility, many empaths begin moving in the opposite direction, not because they're afraid, but because they're aware of how easily identity can become fragmented, aware of how quickly external input can distort internal clarity, aware of how much energy it takes to constantly be perceived. And once you become aware of that cost, you start making different choices, not dramatic ones, but intentional ones. You share less, you explain less, you expose less, not because you have less to offer, but because you've become more selective about where it goes. And that selectivity is often misunderstood. People interpret it as insecurity. They interpret it as withdrawal. They interpret it as a lack of confidence. But what they're often witnessing is the early stage of independence. Because true independence doesn't always look loud. It often looks quiet. It looks like someone who no longer needs constant reinforcement. Someone who doesn't feel compelled to explain themselves. Someone who is comfortable existing without being constantly acknowledged. And that kind of comfort is rare, because most people are still operating inside the system, still seeking reaction, still measuring response, still adjusting based on feedback. But empaths, especially those who have developed self-awareness, begin stepping outside of it. Not completely, but enough to see it clearly. And once you see it clearly, participating in it the same way becomes difficult. Because now you understand the trade-off. Visibility gives attention, but it also invites interpretation. Expression creates connection, but it also creates exposure. And for someone who feels deeply, that exposure comes with a cost, an emotional cost, a psychological cost, an energetic cost, and not everyone is willing to pay that cost continuously. So instead of asking, how do I become more visible? They begin asking a different question. What is worth being visible for? And that question changes everything because it shifts focus from quantity to intention, from constant sharing to selective expression, from performance to alignment. And once that shift happens, the need to constantly display yourself begins to fade. Not because you've lost confidence, but because your confidence is no longer dependent on being seen. And that's where a deeper transformation begins. Because when you stop relying on visibility to feel real, you start developing something far more stable. Internal grounding, a sense of self that doesn't fluctuate with attention, a sense of worth that doesn't require confirmation, a sense of identity that exists, even in silence. And silence in this context is often misunderstood. People assume silence means absence, but silence can also mean stability. It can mean certainty. It can mean that nothing needs to be proven, because nothing is being questioned internally. And many empaths reach a point where that internal certainty becomes more valuable than external recognition, because recognition is temporary, but alignment stays. And once someone experiences that kind of alignment, they become far less interested in constantly presenting themselves, not because they don't exist, but because they no longer need to prove that they do. Once you begin to understand that this behavior is not about insecurity, a more interesting question starts to emerge. If it's not a lack of confidence, then why do so many empaths actively protect their privacy? Why do they choose not to share, even when they have something worth sharing? And this is where most people misunderstand the psychology completely, because privacy for an empath is not about hiding. It's about protection. Not protection in the sense of fear, but protection in the sense of awareness. Because highly sensitive people experience exposure differently. What feels casual to one person can feel invasive to another. What seems like harmless sharing can feel like opening a door that cannot easily be closed. And this difference is not imaginary. It comes from how deeply information is processed. Empaths don't just think about what they share. They feel the consequences of it. They anticipate the impact because they understand something subtle but powerful. The moment you reveal yourself, you invite interpretation, and interpretation is never neutral. Once something leaves you, it no longer belongs only to you. It enters other people's minds, their assumptions, their projections, their biases, their emotional states. And from that moment on, it gets reshaped. Sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, but rarely accurately. And most people overlook this completely. They share without thinking about where that information travels or how it transforms. But empaths often feel that transformation instantly. They sense the shift. They sense how quickly something personal becomes something public, and how quickly something public becomes something distorted. Because not everyone observing you is observing you with clarity. Some people observe through comparison. They measure themselves against you. Some observe through insecurity. They look for flaws because it stabilizes their own self-image. Some observe through envy. They don't want what you have. They want you to not have it. And some observe through curiosity, not to understand you, but to access you, to study you, to analyze you, to find entry points into your life. And empaths, especially those who have been hurt before, become highly aware of this because they've experienced it. They've seen how openness can be used against them, how vulnerability can be misunderstood, how personal details can become leverage. And once that pattern becomes visible, their behavior changes, not dramatically, but deliberately. They stop treating visibility casually. They start treating it as something that requires intention because they realize something important. Access is not neutral. The more access you give, the more influence others have, not always directly, but psychologically, through interpretation, through reaction, through subtle shifts in how you're perceived. And when you are someone who processes deeply, those shifts matter. They don't disappear quickly. They linger. They echo. They accumulate. So instead of continuing to expose themselves freely, many empaths begin to draw boundaries. And this is where people misunderstand them the most. Because boundaries don't always look like strength. They often look like distance. They look like someone pulling back, someone sharing less, someone becoming harder to read. And from the outside, that gets labeled quickly. They've changed. They've become cold. They've become guarded. But what's actually happening is far more precise. They've become selective. And selectivity is not the same as fear. It's not about distrusting everyone. It's about recognizing that not everyone deserves the same level of access. That is discernment. And discernment is one of the clearest signs of emotional maturity, because immature openness gives everything away. But mature awareness understands value. It understands that not everything should be available to everyone at all times. And most empaths develop this understanding through experience. Not theory, but repetition. They give too much. They trust too quickly. They assume others operate with the same sincerity. And eventually, reality corrects that assumption. They encounter people who misinterpret them, people who project onto them, people who use their openness as leverage. And after enough of those experiences, a shift begins. Subtle at first, but irreversible over time. They stop seeing openness as automatically virtuous, and they begin seeing selectivity as necessary. This is not a loss of kindness, it's a refinement of it. Because now, kindness becomes intentional. Instead of automatic, now openness becomes earned instead of assumed. And that shift is powerful because it changes how you relate to yourself. Not just to others, you begin to value your own boundaries. You begin to recognize your own limits. You begin to understand that protecting your energy is not selfish, it's responsible. And this is where privacy begins to take on a new meaning. It is no longer something you default to. It becomes something you choose, not out of fear, but out of clarity. You start asking different questions. Who actually needs access to this part of my life? What purpose does sharing this serve? Is this expression? Or is this exposure? And those questions create a filter most people never develop, because most people are still operating on impulse and habit. They share because it feels normal. They post because it feels expected. They expose because it feels harmless. But empaths often feel the cost behind those actions. They feel the after effects, the mental replay, the emotional residue, the subtle exhaustion that follows unnecessary exposure. And whether you describe this in emotional terms or neurological terms, the pattern is consistent. Highly sensitive individuals process social input more deeply. They hold on to interactions longer. They analyze reactions more thoroughly. They feel tension others might ignore. So what appears to others as overprotectiveness is often a rational response to heightened processing. They are not avoiding imaginary damage. They are preventing anticipated damage. And prevention requires awareness. It requires discipline. It requires the ability to step back before something becomes overwhelming. And that's exactly what many empaths learn to do. They don't wait to repair themselves after repeated harm. They structure their lives to reduce unnecessary harm in the first place. And that is a form of intelligence, a quiet, often invisible intelligence, because it doesn't announce itself. It simply changes behavior. You share less. You reveal less. You expose less. Not because you've become closed, but because you've become conscious. And consciousness always looks unusual to people operating unconsciously. That's why this behavior is so often misunderstood, because it doesn't match the dominant pattern. The dominant pattern is exposure, constant visibility, constant sharing, constant presentation. But empaths who have developed awareness begin stepping outside of that pattern. They begin choosing something different. They begin choosing boundaries. And boundaries are not walls. That's an important distinction. Walls are rigid. They block everything. They isolate completely. Boundaries are selective. They allow access, but not without intention. And learning that difference is a turning point in emotional development. Because once you understand boundaries, you stop feeling guilty for protecting yourself. You stop feeling obligated to make yourself accessible to everyone. You stop confusing openness with obligation. And that shift changes everything, because now privacy becomes something else entirely. It becomes self-respect. It becomes the decision to not make yourself easily available to what does not value you. It becomes the ability to say without saying, not everyone gets access to this part of me. And that kind of self-respect is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply exists in the choices you make, in what you share, in what you keep, in who you allow close. And over time, those choices begin to shape your entire experience, because the less unnecessary exposure you have, the less unnecessary interference you experience, the less noise, the less projection, the less emotional clutter. And in that space, something important begins to develop: clarity. Because clarity requires space. It requires distance from constant input. It requires moments where your identity is not being shaped by external reactions. And privacy creates that space. It allows you to exist without being constantly interpreted. And for many empaths, that is not just preferable, it is necessary. Because constant interpretation feels like constant pressure. And constant pressure eventually becomes exhaustion. So instead of continuing to participate in systems that create that pressure, they begin to step back. Not completely, but enough to protect themselves. And that protection is often invisible to others because it doesn't look dramatic. It looks like someone posting less, someone sharing less, someone becoming quieter. But underneath that quiet, there is intention. There is awareness. There is a deliberate choice to not make everything public. And that choice is often the beginning of something deeper. Because once you stop exposing yourself unnecessarily, you begin to reclaim something that was being diluted: your sense of ownership over your own life, your sense of control over your own identity, your sense of authority over your own boundaries. And that shift is powerful because now you are no longer reacting to the world constantly. You are deciding how much of yourself the world gets to see. And that is where psychological independence begins, not in isolation, but in control. Control over access, control over exposure, control over energy. And once that control is established, something interesting happens. Silence stops feeling empty. It starts feeling intentional. Privacy stops feeling restrictive. It starts feeling protective. And selectivity stops feeling like loss. It starts feeling like alignment. Because you are no longer giving yourself away without awareness. You are choosing where you show up and where you don't. And that choice is one of the clearest signs of emotional maturity. Once you understand that many empaths are not avoiding visibility and that they are not simply protecting their privacy, a deeper pattern begins to reveal itself. Because for many of them, the decision not to constantly share their lives is tied to something even more fundamental. They are often more interested in experiencing life than performing it. And that distinction may be one of the most important psychological divides of our time. Because modern culture has quietly trained people to confuse documentation with participation, to believe that if a moment is not shared, it somehow matters less. That if an experience is not displayed, it is incomplete. That if others do not witness it, it loses significance. But empaths often resist this idea instinctively because they relate to life through presence, not performance. And those two modes are not the same. Performance asks, how will this look? Presence asks, how fully am I here? Performance divides attention. Presence concentrates it. Performance turns experience outward. Presence deepens it inward. And the moment you begin preparing an experience for the eyes of others, something subtle changes. Your attention splits. Part of you remains in the moment, but another part steps outside of it. It begins to frame, to adjust, to anticipate reaction. And many empaths feel that shift immediately. They sense how quickly a living can turn into presenting, and they resist it, not aggressively, but quietly. Because to them, that shift feels like a loss of depth, a loss of authenticity, a loss of connection to the moment itself. And over time, they begin to choose differently. They begin choosing moments that are fully lived rather than partially observed, experiences that belong entirely to them rather than to an audience, because they understand something that most people never pause to consider. Attention is not neutral. Where your attention goes, your experience is shaped. And if your attention is constantly redirected toward how something appears, then your experience becomes filtered, reduced, fragmented. And many empaths refuse to live that way. They prefer the unfiltered version of life, the conversation no one else hears, the moment no one else interrupts, the memory that is never converted into content. Because once everything becomes content, something essential is lost. The intimacy of being present, the depth of undivided attention, the quiet meaning that doesn't need witnesses. And for many empaths, those things matter more than visibility. But there's another layer to this that runs even deeper. Many empaths are deeply uncomfortable with the idea of turning themselves into something to be consumed, something to be evaluated, something to be arranged for approval. And this discomfort can be difficult to explain because most people have normalized it. They've accepted self-presentation as part of identity. They've adapted to being observed, but empaths often feel the tension inside that adaptation. They sense when identity begins to shift into product, when personhood begins to shift into performance. And many of them quietly step away from that, not because they reject connection, but because they don't want to become a version of themselves designed for consumption. They want to remain real. And in a culture built on spectacle, remaining unperformed is a form of resistance, a quiet one, but a powerful one. Because it means you are no longer shaping yourself based on how you will be received. You are simply existing as you are. And that kind of existence is rare. Because most people are still adjusting themselves constantly, still editing, still filtering, still anticipating response. But empaths who step out of that cycle begin to live differently. They stop asking, how will this be perceived? And they return to a simpler question. What is this moment asking me to experience? And that shift changes everything. Because now life is no longer something to be displayed. It becomes something to be lived fully, more slowly, more deeply, more honestly, without the pressure of constant observation. And over time, this way of living creates something most people rarely experience. Presence, true presence. The ability to be fully engaged in what is happening, without distraction, without projection, without performance. And presence is powerful. It sharpens perception. It deepens relationships. It restores clarity. It stabilizes emotion. And many empaths begin to value it above visibility. Not because visibility is wrong, but because presence is more real. But this evolution doesn't happen in isolation. For many empaths, it is shaped by experience, by what they have been through. Because many of them were not always this way. They were once open, very open. They shared easily. They trusted quickly. They revealed themselves without hesitation. And for a time, that openness felt natural. Until it wasn't. Because life begins to teach, not through theory, but through consequence, through being misunderstood in moments of sincerity, through being judged without context, through being hurt after being open, through realizing that visibility can attract more than connection. It can attract projection, manipulation, exploitation. And when that realization lands deeply enough, something changes, not suddenly, but permanently. The empath becomes more discerning, more aware of patterns, more cautious with access, more selective with exposure. And from the outside, this shift is often misinterpreted. People assume they've become distant, cold, guarded, but what has actually happened is far more precise. They've developed standards, and standards, especially after pain, are the foundation of self-respect. Because self-respect begins the moment you stop offering yourself where you are repeatedly mishandled. And many empaths reach that point, not because they want to withdraw, but because they are no longer willing to be careless with themselves. They stop over-explaining to people, committed to misunderstanding them. They stop offering vulnerability to people who misuse it. They stop placing themselves in environments that diminish them. And sometimes they stop making themselves visible. Not because they fear being seen, but because they understand the cost of being seen by the wrong people. And that understanding creates discipline, a quiet discipline. Because now they begin to operate differently. They begin to ask, who deserves access to me? Who has shown the capacity to understand, not just observe? Who has earned the right to see deeper layers of who I am? And those questions change behavior. They create distance from what is superficial and alignment with what is meaningful. And over time, this alignment strengthens something within them. Self-possession, the ability to belong to yourself, not to public opinion, not to external validation, not to constant visibility. And self-possession is powerful because once you possess yourself, you cannot be easily defined by others. You cannot be easily manipulated. You cannot be easily pulled into systems that require you to prove your worth. And that is where real freedom begins, not in being seen by everyone, but in not needing to be. Because the need to be seen is often where control begins. Control through approval, control through reaction, control through perception. But when that need disappears, so does that control. And what remains is something far more stable. A sense of identity that does not fluctuate. A sense of worth that does not require confirmation. A sense of presence that does not depend on visibility. And from the outside, this can look like absence, like someone who has stepped back, but from the inside, it feels like alignment. It feels like clarity. It feels like no longer needing to perform yourself for the world. And maybe this is what people misunderstand the most. Because when someone becomes less visible, the assumption is that they have become smaller. But sometimes they have simply stopped making themselves available to what makes them feel small. And that is not withdrawal. That is self-respect taking form. Because one of the highest forms of strength is the ability to walk away from what diminishes you, to step back from what drains you, to refuse to participate in what distorts you, and to choose quietly but firmly what deserves your presence and what does not. And that choice is what defines maturity, not how much you share, but how intentionally you share it, not how visible you are, but how aligned you are, not how much attention you receive, but how little you depend on it. And for many empaths, this is the direction they move in, gradually, quietly, deliberately, until one day, they no longer feel the need to constantly show themselves at all, because they are no longer searching for confirmation. They are no longer negotiating their worth. They are no longer performing their identity. They are simply living it. And there is something deeply powerful in that. Because in a world where nearly everyone is being pulled toward performance, the person who chooses presence becomes rare. The person who refuses to turn their life into constant display becomes grounded. And the person who lives for depth instead of visibility begins to understand something others miss. That meaning does not require witnesses. That value does not require exposure. That identity does not require performance. And maybe this is the final truth behind it all. Not everyone who is quiet is hiding. Not everyone who is private is insecure. Not everyone who is unseen is lacking. Some people have simply realized something that others are still chasing, that the moment you stop asking the world to confirm your worth is the moment you begin to fully own it. And once you own it, you no longer need to display it. If you saw yourself somewhere in this, that's not accidental, because these patterns don't just exist in theory. They exist in real people, real relationships, real experiences. And if you want to understand empaths, avoidance, and the dynamics that connect them. This is what we do here at Empath Avoidant Dynamics. New insights every day. So if you're not subscribed yet, make sure you are. Because the more you understand these patterns, the harder it becomes to be controlled by them.